Well, greetings. My name is James Stoner. I'm director of the Eric Voegelin Institute at Louisiana State University, and it's my privilege to welcome you back for the third in a five-part series of talks on the theme, Who was Eric Voegelin and what did he think? Voegelin taught at LSU from 1942 to 58 and achieved international notice during his time here. After discussing Voegelin's biography and his political science in our first two sessions, which, by the way, are available on our website, linked in the chat in recorded form, after that, we turn today to the central ideas of his philosophy, looking in particular at the essays collected in the third part of the Eric Voegelin Reader. This is the Eric Voegelin Reader. We've sort of been using it as our guide for topics in Voegelin. And I have the table of contents of the reader on the website, which is in that link on the chat, in case you want to see which essays in particular we'll be discussing. Today, we're honored to have as our guest Dr. Carol Browning Cooper. Dr. Cooper earned her PhD at Catholic University, where she studied with Professor David Walsh, who is our next speaker 2 weeks from today, and I think might be in the audience today. And she wrote on Kant and international relations for her dissertation. She now teaches at the University of Houston in both political science and in the Honors College. Our format today, as the last couple times, will be as follows. Dr. Cooper and I will have a conversation to introduce the topic for about a half hour or 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions, asking you to use the raise hand function on Zoom. You can find it under the reactions button, and I'll recognize questioners and ask you then and only then to unmute yourself. Well, let's get started. Dr. Cooper, welcome to the Voegelin Institute. In our first sessions, we found ourselves running into various terms that Voegelin uses in his writing, trying to sort out their meaning, wrestling last time in particular with the term symbol. We'll get to that term later today. It's in the title of one of the essays, I think, but I wonder if we could start with the term that he uses in the first of the essays in our section of the reader, this term, divine ground. What does Voegelin mean by that? Is it God? And if he means God, why doesn't he say God rather than divine ground?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm so glad to be here. And it's really wonderful that you guys are putting on this seminar. I think it's beneficial for a great number of people. I've listened to the first two sessions and they've been very helpful for me too. And I guess I should say too, just to clarify, that you've had two Dr. Coopers come on the session so far, but we're not related. And Barry Cooper is the sort of the original Voegelinian Cooper. I'm the new kid, I guess. But the question of the divine ground, yeah, that's an important one for Voegelin. I think that he wants to talk about something in terms that are familiar, but also technically helpful. So he calls it divine, I think, because for two reasons. Because God, I think, is the most common symbol that people tend to use to refer to the idea of the ground, and also because the ground that he thinks people are seeking has characteristics that would classically be associated with the divine. Or with divinity. So things like immortality, in the sense that it doesn't die like human beings do. It was here before us and will be here after us. So permanence and universality, all of these ideas that work, classically, and then, even to the modern age would be associated with the idea of God. And so, he's giving the ground that adjective divine in order to symbolize what exactly it is that he's seeking.
So why ground? Divine ground is just at some level just a sort of funny thing, because if you think of ground as dirt or something like that, that would seem to be at odds with what's divine, completely at odds with what's divine. And even if it's rock, it seems, well, maybe permanent, but hardly noble. And maybe some rocks are beautiful, I guess some mountains, but why this idea of the ground? What's the point of that?
Yeah, I don't think it's that terribly unrelated. So if you look at the questions, he brings up a couple of times in these essays the question, why does anything exist? Why is there something and not nothing? The question of existence and the question of essence. Why is what exists the way that it is and not different? And we know these questions, they're familiar to us because we're all philosophers here. But if you think about it in terms of, if you go back to the original experience that he wants to talk about and think about it in those terms, prior to the questions being articulated, it wouldn't be that far away, or you could articulate it in a way that it's not that far away from from the literal physical world, so any child could sort of look around and think, well, all of this was here before I got here. And it's all going to continue to exist after I leave. And so it's very easy to sort of come to the natural conclusion that there is something out there that's bigger than me. The tree, the river, the rock, in a sense, have a stronger hold on being than I do. I am impermanent and rather fragile. And to use even that sort of literal idea of the ground as sort of a stepping stone to thinking, well, there must be something beyond me. This is a very basic experience, but I think even, then beyond that, the idea of the ground is just something as like a something to stand on as an origin point. So if you look at the Greek societies, for example, with their preoccupation with the arche, the beginning, and all societies have this desire to seek the origin of their society, to ground the origin of their society, if not in some, misty past, which, we in the United States don't have the ability to do, at least to something permanent, right? You want to go to, if we don't have, an arche early in time, well, we can at least talk about like, well, we're grounded on first principles, right? So that there's something permanent, firm, and long-lasting, durable in the way that the ground is, like the dirt, the rock. But more metaphysically speaking, that there's something durable there that underlies everything that we're doing. And we're not exactly sure what it is because, in a sense, we're standing on it and it's hard to see the ground underneath your feet, but you're standing on it. So there's got to be something there. Does that kind of explain? Does that answer your question?
That's enormously helpful. I mean, we don't even see what's underground, do we? So it's where we stand, but we don't see it. But here's the thought that came up to me as you were speaking. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I'm a political scientist. Whether I'm not going to claim to be all philosophers, maybe all but me, but I'm a political scientist, so I can be very pedestrian about these things, as you can already see. Why doesn't he use the term nature? Because the things you described that the child sees or experiences, the ground, you would think of the ground as nature and rocks are nature. What the child sees that's here and lasts, well, maybe it's not all nature. It takes a while. Actually, we'll see some things in nature die. We know that. But why doesn't he use the term nature? Because he doesn't, does he? I don't know that term features much in Voegelin at all.
I agree with you. He does not resort to that term very often, if at all. And I don't know that I've ever read him answer the question, why not? He does talk of the problem of modern man seeking to control nature, right? And doesn't he see that as a problem? Maybe that's the reason, is that we now think of nature, when we speak of nature, we don't think of it as anything that can have authority or anything solid that we can stand on. In fact, but it's all somehow fluid and manipulable. Right. So, and maybe in nature, understood in that way, is just one of those symbols that has become opaque. It's hard to say nature and have the idea in the other person's head come up with anything more than like trees. And maybe the ground is the same way, but for whatever reason, I guess that he thought that the symbol of the ground was more likely to be able to, you can immediately kind of evoke that basic immediate experience of just, being in a world that we don't quite understand, being a self that we don't quite understand in a world that we don't quite understand. But then it becomes transparent to, something that goes beyond that, to what he's really seeking, which is, what he calls non-existent reality. Nature is rather, existent reality. It's there. Well, now this is a term, I mean, as a political scientist, if there's any term that really throws me in Voegelin, it's this non-existent reality, because
political scientists tend to think that reality is what exists. So how, it almost sounds like an oxymoron. What does he mean by non-existent reality?
Yeah, I think that he's talking about, well, I mean, let me say this. I am not super sure that he uses the term consistently. And I think that maybe he uses it in two different ways. Because sometimes he uses non-existent as an adjective to describe a whole set of experiences and things that are simply not material. They're either not bound, they're neither not material, they're not bound by time, or they're events that don't really have any kind of like tangible being. So if you look, for example, on page like 148. In the beginning of the immortality essay, where he talks about the mode of non-existence attaches to non-existent reality, but it also attaches to the consciousness of participation in non-existent reality, and it also attaches to the symbols that come out of that conscious participation. So sometimes he uses it in a pretty expansive way, but at other times I think he uses it very, very specifically to refer to a reality that transcends being. And so because it's real, it has reality, but because it transcends anything that exists in being, in created being, it itself doesn't exist. If I could, resort to a religious example that I think maybe might explain it, at least for religious people, it would be like John Scotus Erigena wrote that God does not know what he is because he is not anything, right? God doesn't exist because he transcends being. Well, God, it's not that there is no God. It's just that whatever God isn't included in the category of things that exist within being because God transcends being. And so that would be one way to think of it in using religious language of God. But obviously Voegelin wants to be more philosophical, right? And so you can make a parallel between what he's talking about here and that particular kind of religious understanding of God, but he's looking at something, he wants a term that's more philosophical, and so he's going to go with non-existent reality as that sense of the mystery that goes beyond what exists and what comes into being and goes out of being.
So I think I can get now what's meant by non-existent, right? It's not susceptible to sensory perception, right? We can't, or even recognition over time, maybe, right? The existent is in time, it's in space, right? But how do we know that this thing is real? I mean, it's easy to know that it's not, that it must be non-existent because we can't see it, right? And we can't touch it, and we can't, well, let's just say can't see it and touch it, right? Or experience it with our senses, but how do we know that it's real?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he resorts to a number of examples. The Egyptian poem and the immortality essay is a good one, but he also talks about Plato and Aristotle, Augustine and Aquinas, and many others who have just sort of persistently experienced this relationship to reality as some kind of a partnership, right? I mean, there is this sense of being attracted or being pulled. There's a desire to know. There's a desire to question, and even after one comes to the conclusion that the questions have no answers, nevertheless, the questions themselves seem to, have some hold over us as human beings.
Well, is it experience then that is I mean, sometimes we use experience. You think at first when you talk about experience, you think of, well, what we experience with our senses. But now you're saying Voegelin's talking about experiences that are non-sensory, but they're nevertheless genuine or real experiences. Is that what's going on here?
Right, and I mean, they may be sensory in the sense that they provoke certain emotions in people. Yeah, the Egyptian discourse that he analyzes here in the immortality essay, that person had quite strong emotions as a result of what he was experiencing, the reality that he was experiencing. But no, for Voegelin, the experience is never going to be, simply a subjective thing. It is something that is, he thinks, just fundamental to what it means to be human, if you are paying attention to it.
So an experience is not objective, but it is real.
Yeah.
And that becomes what that becomes the ground. So the ground is just, you said a symbol, right? And then you said God is a symbol. We've used this term symbol all the time. I wonder if we could clarify what he means by symbol and how it operates in his thought.
Yeah. So it operates in three levels. There's the experience is the primary level. Having experiences, human beings symbolize them. So that's sort of the secondary level. And then out of those symbols come ideas, concepts, doctrines, dogmas. He uses a variety of terms to talk about the sort of the third level. So maybe he gives himself permission in the immortality essay to use colloquialism. So maybe I'll just give an example that's fairly colloquial. We were teaching Rousseau last week. We read Rousseau's second discourse in our class last week, and maybe Rousseau's not the cleanest example of what the kind of experience that Voegelin is talking about. And we can debate that, but
it's okay. Political scientists have heard of Rousseau. So.
Yes. So Rousseau in his second discourse, he has he has a wonderful diagnosis of that sense of alienation that human beings have, both within personally, like within individual relationships and societally, right? And Rousseau diagnoses this particular form of alienation kind of in terms of like, all of my problems exist because of other people, right? Like if other people didn't exist, I would not have these moral and personal problems, that I would not have this sense of dependence. I would not have this experience of resentment that comes from feeling like I'm dependent on other people. So really it's other people that are the problem, right? And that sense of alienation that he describes, I think is very relatable, right? The way that we put on performances and put on masks and have to pretend for other people's delicate sensibilities and lie about how we really feel about things, and the way that this sort of distorts who we are and creates resentment and frustrates our relationships and corrupts our politics. So all of that is very relatable in terms of an experience. But how does Rousseau symbolize it? Well, then he goes on to symbolize it in this story that he tells about human beings in a state of nature, and he writes the state of nature as if human beings are totally isolated and had no relationships to each other that had any lasting or meaning or importance. The most that we do have is the sort of like arm's length pity. We feel a bit sorry for people who find themselves in unfortunate situations. But that's it. And we have no responsibilities, and therefore we're completely free. That's the symbol. Right. And then out of that symbol come certain ideas like, human beings are basically good and society is responsible for corrupting all of them. And already at that level of the idea, you're oversimplifying what Rousseau said. So that, that's, thing one. But then thing two, you can see that at the level of the idea, it's almost obviously wrong, or if it's at least arguable, right? I mean, it's not obviously true anymore, and it's not relatable in the way that his experience was relatable. So if you describe the experience, he becomes very relatable. But if you talk about him only in terms of, well, these are the set of ideas, this is what Rousseau believed, this is Rousseau's teaching, it becomes sort of brittle and no longer true to what he was really trying to communicate. And yet at the same time, like that experience, what he was really trying to communicate isn't super obvious in the text. Like you have to dig down, right? Is that helping explain the difference between the experience, the symbol, and the idea?
No, that's enormously helpful. So experience, I guess what I'm wondering now is what's the most authentic of those, the experience, and then the symbol is a step back. But then it seems the idea, what symbols necessarily become ideas, but once they become ideas, they sort of are two steps away from the experience. So there's a problem with ideas, right? I mean, because, again, we talked about this in terms of Voegelin's analysis of politics. If you just take ideas and meld them together into some sort of system, you get an ideology, and that seems to be a real problem for Voegelin, doesn't it? So is that what's going on here?
Yeah, it is. And I'm going to point to his analysis of this Egyptian poem and the immortality essay, because I think this is it's a really wonderful example of the way that he takes, something that is completely foreign, first of all, foreign from us in time and in space and in culture. And this was, I think, Voegelin's really unique genius, was to be able to take, sources, pieces of literature and philosophy like this, and then go down and be able to dig down into them and analyze them in terms of the experiences. He sees this man who's having this argument with his soul, and the man finds himself sort of, he is having an experience that no one else around him seems to validate, but he himself refuses to give up on the truth of the experience. This reminds me too, we were reading in a different class, Frederick Douglass this morning, his narrative of his life as a slave. On the very first page, he emphasizes how the slave masters refused to let the slave children ask questions. And yet the question stuck with him, even as a much older man. He was able to articulate the questions that he had as a child, and the frustrations that he had that sort of forced those questions into being. And so that even though he was existing in a context where everyone around him said, stop asking questions, shut up, it's not for you to ask, that he as a human being was able to say, no, these questions are mine. I'm going to hold on to them because I know the reality of my condition, even though everyone else around me is telling me to lie and stop asking questions. I know it. And the man here is kind of in the same situation where he knows that the condition of his existence is problematic. It's wrong on many different levels. It is come to the point where he does not feel it is worthy of him continuing to live in this existence anymore. And so first he kind of like has this conversation with his soul, and the soul in the poem is given the role of kind of the conventional answers to the questions the man is raising about, is life even worth living? Its existence seems to have become a burden that I in my truest self, I'm no longer willing to bear. And so he says that the soul gives three answers to this. And one of them is basically the answer of conventional belief. Life is a gift. You should be grateful for it. Live, laugh, love. It's all fine, right? I mean, just sort of these like shallow conventional pieties. And the man is rightfully dissatisfied with these things. And says to his soul in response, well, look, since you're so worried about those things, I'll make sure that when I kill myself, we do all of the right sacrifices and everything, so you'll be taken care of in the afterlife. At which point the soul kind of responds like, well, but like, do we know that there's an afterlife? Are we really so sure? And immediately slots over into this skepticism. And maybe if we're not so sure, that we should just sort of keep what you have for a little bit longer. You don't really know that there's any immortality on the other side of this. And again, the man pushes back against this, and so the soul then takes the third way. When Voegelin analyzes this poem in order in history, he calls this third step moral suicide, to sort of juxtapose it with the physical suicide that the man is contemplating. Which is the third step. The soul then says, well, look, your problem is you're just taking all of this way too seriously. You just need to lighten up. Like, life isn't really that serious. You're overthinking things. Just like go have fun, and stop thinking so hard, right? It's the same thing. It's like, stop asking questions. Like, that's your whole problem right there. You wouldn't have all these existential concerns if you would just stop asking so many questions. And at this point, the man stops talking to his soul and just sort of articulates his position, in which he insists that it is serious and he is going to ask questions, but he is neither going to give into the sort of the conventional pieties, nor is he going to give into the skepticism. And then he goes on, to analyze this. And so that's the, I think that's the experience that he's talking about, the insistence on, no, my understanding of my condition in reality is true, and I am not going to be placated either by being told what to believe or by a sort of the skepticism that necessarily reacts to those kinds of dogmas, or to the kind of the moral suicide of like, well, nothing really matters, so I guess we'll just have fun. That's the sort of the essential kind of personality or attitude that you need to have in order to be true to these kinds of experiences. This all comes to a head on page 162, where he starts talking about these things in terms of attention. And this is where we come back to the reality of it, right? The reality of something that is non-existent and yet able to be experienced. And he talks about tensions in basically like two dimensions. So one of them, he says, the philosopher or the person who having this kind of experience finds himself in tension between order and disorder, and that's the primary field. So that you exist in this reality where you can see, for example, of the man who can see disorder all around you, and yet there is this allegiance. There's something inside of you that says, no, I can discern that there is disorder around me because I have some sense of what order looks like. I don't know what it is, but I know it's not this, right? And then second, he says there's tensions on another level, and in this case, evaluating the man with his soul, the tensions on the other level are going to be between belief and unbelief, or between shallow pieties and the skepticism that they provoke. So if you think about this, the situation of the human being here is kind of like a tightrope walker. Okay, so the rope that the person is walking on is strung between the poles of disorder and order. So we don't have order, but we know it's out there. We can turn our faces towards it and walk that way. But you've seen tightrope walkers, and they carry a stick, right? That sort of goes off on the other direction. And in order to keep balance on the tension between the two poles that are holding the rope up, the philosopher has to stand midway between that pole that he's holding to. So you have belief on one end, and you have unbelief on the other end. And the philosopher's job is not either to sort of side with the pious beliefs, regardless of the fact that they may, be holding society together on some shallow level, nor is it the philosopher's job to side with the skepticism that those beliefs rightfully provoke because they are shallow. You can see the sort of the truth there, you can relate to the impulse to want to push back against the shallow pieties, right? He says, so we have to sort of like grant them the intellectual objection that they make, but you can't go all the way over there, you're going to fall off, right? So the philosopher finds himself in the middle of this, or on this tension between disorder and order, in the middle, holding the balance between belief and unbelief, able to sort of grant a limited truth to each side, but not take either side, because then you fall off.
That was marvelous. Now here's what I'm wondering: are all experiences equal? I mean, Voegelin seems to privilege, as people would say today, this philosophical experience, or this dissatisfaction. To put it in context, you're speaking to us in Louisiana as we prepare for Mardi Gras, and so the overwhelming social mood right now is one of relaxing and not thinking about these things, and immersing oneself in the immediate joys of existence. But Voegelin seems to suggest, well, no, these are not all equal experiences, in the same way that symbols maybe are not all equal to one another, or symbols aren't equal to doctrines. So how does one sort that out? How does one develop a kind of hierarchy of symbols, or if it isn't too contradictory, a hierarchy of grounds, or of ways of speaking seriously about the most serious things and defending seriousness itself against the tendencies that are prevalent, I think, not only at Mardi Gras in Louisiana, but more generally in modern society towards the pleasant, the comfortable, the amusing.
Yeah. Well, these sorts of experiences are uncomfortable, right? So there's always going to be a tendency to want to just sort of, numb and distract and ignore. Who was it that said that, humanity's problem is that they can't spend 5 minutes alone in a room with themselves? It's something along those lines, right? So no, not all experiences are going to be equal. And in some ways, it is unusual for there to be people who are willing to undertake this kind of exploration. And even then, I don't think that it can be done in all seriousness all the time. And there's something to be said for giving it a rest once in a while.
Isn't that what doctrine does? Because one of the interesting things, as I remember, Voegelin gives that lecture that you're speaking about, the immortality one, at Harvard Divinity School. And at one point in it, he is very critical of doctrine and dogma. And I would have thought that actually that's a help to us ordinary people, us political scientists maybe, who to sort of pull us out of our everydayness and give us, I don't know, a ladder to climb or something maybe besides the ground itself to stand on to start to approach the divine or the more serious things, even to learn what the serious questions are. But Voegelin seems to think dogma is more a problem than an aid. Is that right? Or am I wrong on that?
He thinks that it has problems. He thinks that it's good insofar as I'm looking on 161 here. He says, as long as you don't fall into the false premise that doctrinal truth is not derivative but original. Okay, so the false idea would be that doctrine is the original thing, like that is the thing that must be believed. If you understand that there's 3 steps removed from reality, and that it's only helpful insofar as it shows you the direction in which you need to keep going. It gives you some sense of the reality that you're looking for. And I think he thinks that it can be helpful, but there's a tendency that I think he thinks is just inherent in talking about things on the level of doctrines or ideas, to turn them into things and to turn them into, to treat them as if they are the thing with the most reality when they're not the thing with the most reality. And as soon as you do that, he says, it provokes a counter reaction, and it should. But then you're going to end up in this sort of like inevitable tension between the doctrine and the skeptical objection to the doctrine, which also leads to the problems of then thinking that those are the only 2 choices. And so it's just sort of a zero-sum game between believers and non-believers. People who hold to the doctrine and people who are skeptical of the doctrine, which, even frankly leads to like bad atheism, right? It's sort of like Dawkins style atheism. And it's like, well, okay, well, it's easy enough, to grant that like the flying spaghetti monster doesn't exist. But at this point, we're not really talking about God anymore, right? And so if everything's going to be just reduced to, a conception of God which is capable of being twisted into flying spaghetti monster, and the people who object to the flying spaghetti monster, we're not even having a rational conversation anymore at that point. And so he sees this as just like that's inherent to having a conversation on that level. It's going to just devolve into nonsense.
Nonsense or worse, right? I mean, isn't what when he puts all of this in historical we've been speaking sort of outside of the historical context, right, of both the development of religions and then, except for your last suggestions, the sort of secularization of society. But doesn't he say that it's the characteristic of modern ideologies that they start from skepticism and then build dogmas upon skepticism? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, sure. Many of them do. Yeah.
I mean, so they're doubly, I mean, or I guess maybe not doubly bad, but they're problematic first as dogmas, and secondly, as dogmas that are closed to these, would you call them religious experiences or philosophical experiences? Or is there a difference between those levels of experience? Because that's the other thing we haven't talked about, it right, is the difference between what he calls the cosmological, and then what's the next era, the sort of transcendent, is it? And so what is that difference between sort of the God, because the Egyptian comes from what he calls the cosmological era, right? The story of the gods as if they were just superhumans in a kind of way. And then he says there's what is this term? Differentiation. There's a new complication or a new level of thinking. How does that all relate to what we've been speaking about?
Yeah, well, in the readings in this unit, he talks about it in terms of, even in the Egyptian poem, but then clearly later in the Greeks, you get this sense that society is a human being writ large, right? And so the experiences that a human being is capable of having, whether those be, religious experiences or, these more philosophical experiences of being in tension towards this divine ground or towards this source of order. But you can also have the more deformed experiences as well. And so the character of the society is going to basically be, the big picture of whatever that basic experience is, and whatever symbol set we're using to talk about it and to expect things from it. If we're using one, I think what he says in these readings is that the next step is not only is society a human being writ large, but history is too. And that's what the cosmological societies didn't really see, because they didn't have the same sense of history that we do. That has to come later out of the anthropological and the soteriological turns. But he ends up saying that it is basically the same kind of thing. So that history becomes imbued, or at least capable of being imbued with these same kinds of experiences that a human being can have, and then you get him looking forward to order in history, sort of drawing the meaning of history or the order of history out of the long history of human beings having these experiences with the divine ground or the non-existent reality or the source of order, however you want to call it.
So experience. So this will be my last question, because you've generated the richest chat I have ever seen on any Zoom meeting now, and I want to get those people now to ask their questions. But the last thing I want to say is, so what Voegelin is saying, is this fair? Is that experience is not a private thing that I have. Or is it something to be authentic? I guess it has to be really mine. But on the other hand, it isn't just private, right? That we each have our own experiences and we live in our own worlds with our own experiences, because that would tend to be modern society, wouldn't it? I mean, but instead he's speaking as if there's something public about experience or something shared about experience. Is that right?
I think, I'm not sure that he articulates it in these essays, but I think at somewhere he writes that it is part and parcel of the experience that it generates the impulse to symbolize it. Because the experience itself is beyond words, and it can't be contained in words or in symbols, frankly. I mean, this is the other problem of the dogmas or the doctrines, is that on some level they're just not true. They give us a little bit of a handle to work with the experiences, to categorize them, analyze them, think about them, understand them, make them personal to us. And different of those languages are going to appeal to different people. But if you take them as the experience themselves, they're fundamentally just untrue. And so it's part of the nature of these experiences to seek some kind of expression, And I don't know, I think he says that that's just part of it. And so if you are a person who has these kinds of experiences, then they're sort of natural, I guess, to use that word. The thing that you do is you symbolize them. You want to share them with other people because it seems true. And human beings are truth seekers, and I think we want to live with other people who also at least care about the same truth that we're trying to care about. And there's a very human, I think, tendency to just be like, look, do you see the world the way I do? Doesn't this also seem true to you? I think that maybe that's one of those basic experiences, but it prompts symbolization.
Well, you've spoken of so many things and laid out such a rich set of topics. I think instead of keeping going with my own questions, which I seem to keep gathering, nevertheless, I would like to open the floor for questions and invite anyone who's spoken in the chat to speak up now and put a question mark at the end of your comment if you want to. And but let's see if we can elicit some questions out of what Dr. Cooper has been asking. Who wants to start? I see one from Studio A here in the Voegelin Institute. So.
I've really enjoyed your analysis of Voegelin. Now, in Voegelin's analysis of immortality, experience, and symbols, he mentions by name William James's Varieties of Religious Experiences, which is a wonderful book that discusses the very thing that Voegelin is concerned about, is how do we not get bogged down by dogma? Because if you analyze this text, it's just various accounts of individuals experiencing something beyond ideology. If I may use my own term, it's seeing beyond just seeing beyond dogma and actually seeing reality in its purest sense. Would you say that both Eric Voegelin, what he's trying to do, and William James, they have the same goal in their books and their analyses, or would you say it's a little different?
I'm not sure that I've read James to the degree that I've read Voegelin, so I can't say specifically. I know that Voegelin often quotes James pretty approvingly, so my guess is that they're at least working with the same problems. So I'm not sure that if that really answers your question. I think there was more to it than just, are they working the same? Because you were asking too about, ideology and trying to see past ideology. And I noticed last time in the session last week, there was a lot of questions sort of like, okay, but now what do we do about this? What's the solution to the problem? How do we, turn around, an ideological system? How do we try to put a sense of order back into society? And so, to the extent that James is going to focus on the experiences as a way to understand and sort of get around the dogmatic deformations, I think Voegelin does the same thing. That he insists that it's not the philosopher's job to try to like suss out the order towards which he's drawn so that he can sort of bring it back in a neat little package and place it onto society. That in a sense, it is the philosopher's job, on the one hand, is kind of like maintain an orientation towards order, but at the same time, the entire field of existence with all of its order and disorder and deformation and problems is part of the philosopher's task to analyze and to understand. And to abandon that task in preference for some kind of an agenda is basically to undermine the purpose of the philosopher's true job. So the answer for Voegelin is always going to be go back to the experience. If you want to sort of reignite order, remember that society is man writ large, and so what do individual people need to do? Open themselves back up to those kinds of experiences. You can't really seek them; they find you, but they can't find you if you're not sort of open to being found. so have that kind of like, that honesty, be open to honesty about yourself and your society, and have some curiosity, go back and be willing to ask the questions that you were made fun of for asking when you were like 8 and then stopped asking them.
Yes, yes, ma'am. So I also really enjoyed the tightrope walker. Was that a reference to Nietzsche, what we've inherited from Nietzsche as modern thinkers? Because he has that scene in Das Spoke Zarathustra whenever everybody's watching a tightrope walker in the town square.
Honestly, no, I just came up with that and doodled it in the book as I was reading.
Okay.
But I'll go look up the Nietzsche passage. That sounds promising. I'll go look that up. Thank you.
Right, subconscious Nietzscheanism. It's a dangerous thing. Next question from Thomas Lorden.
Carol, the word mysticism comes up with Voegelin from time to time. I remember reading somewhere in Voegelin where he talks about Plato and Aristotle as mystic philosophers. Mm-hmm. And I think there are references in works on Voegelin to him being a mystic. Mm-hmm. And when I first heard those references, I thought, well, this means the type of experience that St. Paul had on the road to Damascus, or that St. John of the Cross had, the type of experience that virtually almost all of us have never had and will never have. But as I got further into Voegelin, it occurred to me that he's simply talking about experiences that are available to all of us. From the most to the least educated, and nowadays probably more so to the least educated than to the most educated. So that term mysticism, how do you interpret it in terms of Voegelin, references to Voegelin and his references to philosophers like Plato and Aristotle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are two aspects of it. So one aspect of it is, did Voegelin read the mystics? Was he familiar with them? Was he a mystic? Did he think Plato and Aristotle were mystics? And I think the answer to all of those questions is an emphatic yes. In fact, I see Chip Hughes on here, and I myself asked him that very question at dinner once a few years ago. Hi, Chip. And he gave the answer as a pretty emphatic yes. But on the other hand, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily true that the only kind of experience that he thinks is valid is one of these sort of like, groundbreaking, amazing mystical unitive experiences. Although I think those are more common than people think, because most people who have them don't talk about them. It might inform what they do and what they think and what they write in other ways, but especially nowadays, it's not the kind of thing that one would feel comfortable talking about. It's just rather embarrassing to admit that such things happen to human beings. But I also think that there is a broader class of experiences that he thinks is worth evaluating. I mean, the man here, telling his soul that he's going to kill himself is not exactly having an amazing transcendent experience. But he is having an experience of feeling like he has a sense of order within a context of disorder, and he understands the cognitive dissonance there. He understands that in order to conform to the society around him, he's going to have to lie, and that lying is going to deform his humanity. So it's not a wonderful experience that he's having, but it is an experience of truth.
The experience that Voegelin describes as being led to search for the ground is an experience, I take it, that we can all have. If we get past the fact that the symbols that express it in our culture are opaque. But what is the evidence that Voegelin himself ever had a mystical experience in the sense that we think of that term, some experience that most of us will never have?
I'm not sure. I I would point you to anamnesis as probably the best source of those kinds of, early immediate awarenesses of reality being a certain way and needing to be explored. But I'm not I couldn't point to anything in his works where he said he had some kind of amazing experience of transcendence.
Thank you.
For a very interesting question. Charles Embry is next, to whom we owe a debt because he's one of the editors of the Voegelin Reader that has put these essays together. So thanks for coming, and go ahead, unmute yourself if you could and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm a technological idiot here, but Chip has already beat me to the draw on the chat about the participation. But I would ask, would it help to think of a symbol as a dogma and that the symbol evokes the participation in the experience? Does that make sense, or did anybody get it?
Carol, go ahead if you would with that. Does the symbol evoke an experience? And I guess you're saying what, draw away from the dogma back to the experience. Oh, now you're muted, Charlie. We can see you, but we can't hear you at the same time. So, yeah. Now we can hear you, but we can't see you. Okay, go ahead.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Chip has beat me in the chat to the issue of participation, but I wonder if it might be interesting to think of symbol and dogma as evoking experience, and that when the dogma ceases to evoke the experience, it becomes opaque to experience.
Yes. Yeah, that is what he says. And I think he thinks that the symbol is more likely to do that than the dogma. Because the symbols, when the symbols are sort of just taken as things, they're transformed into dogmas, and they're more likely to become opaque. And in a sense, I think he thinks it's almost inevitable that they will, because an honest person can pick any given dogma and say, well, but that's not true, because it's not. It's at best it's only a symbol. And so, if you understand that the symbol is only meant to lead you further, then the symbol is useful. But as soon as it's sort of thingified, it becomes brittle and undermines its own ends.
Good, thank you.
I think the real problem here is how do you communicate experience? The linguistic skills we have that are available, and how do you formulate the symbol? Make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think one of the things that he's getting at here in this immortality essay is that, one of the ways that you can understand this immortality symbol is when it becomes I think this is a deformation. When you want a piece of communication, when you want a symbol to be the everlasting thing, so that the symbols and the dogmas take on a kind of immortality, or he talks about you want to set up some kind of like permanent solution or some kind of permanent society that's now going to hold this immortality that we're seeking, but it can't. It simply can't. And so the solution is always going to be go back to the experiences. I was talking to Jim a couple of weeks ago, and I told him that this reminded me of something Hans Urs von Balthasar says, and I know that's not Voegelin, but he and Voegelin are on the same page. Balthasar says that being faithful to the tradition consists of much more than just imitating the fathers, or rather, it's being faithful to tradition is not just literally repeating the old symbols. It's not just transmission of the dogma or even the philosophical ideas, but rather it is much more in imitating the people, the fathers, in their attitude of intimate reflection and their effort of creation. So that is the task that we have, is to be reflective, to be attentive to experiences, to be honest, and then to try to create. And so the ongoing communication of these symbols, in order for the symbols to sort of remain alive, they have to constantly keep being renewed. I tell my students this when we talk about, what does it mean to like write originally? And I tell them, I said, look, don't worry about coming up with original ideas. Like, there are no original ideas. The ideas are the same as they always were. The task for you guys is to understand what symbols, language, terminology, your friends, your generation need to explain these same old ideas to yourselves, and then re-explain them. That's your task. That's the creativity that's needed, along with, a sincere devotion to honest exploration of reality.
Great, thank you. We have another question from the Voegelin room.
If I might press you a little more on this question of symbols, there's older language to refer to it. And symbol, it must be a word of origin, but I don't recall the Greeks ever speaking of symbols. They spoke of images or imitations, which might have pointed to the original, but were also markedly inferior to the original in some way. So does a symbol imply some kind of different relationship to the original experience, that it's not inferior in the way that an image or imitation is?
That's a great question. I don't think that Voegelin means for symbol to be truer to the reality than the way that Plato used image. But in that same vein, you see Plato using symbols, right? He attacks imitation through imitation. He attacks art through art, right? So because I think, Plato had the sense that Voegelin also did, is that in order to be true to the experience that the symbol is trying to communicate, the symbol also has to be honest about its own insufficiency.
On page 189 in the Immortality essay, he does make what seems to be a distinction between imagery and symbolism. Okay. Right there, he says, with regard to the symbol immortality, we can say, therefore, the imagery of afterlife originates in the compact experience of cosmic reality, the symbolism of life structured by death originates in man's experience of his existence in tension toward the divine ground. So there's that distinction between the cosmological and the transcendent, I suppose, or the tension. Yeah. And in that way, it seems that symbols are maybe characteristic of the more developed approach. Would that be right? As opposed to images being primary. The only catch is that, of course, Plato uses images and calls them images, and he's exemplary of this more transcendent approach, right?
Yeah, in that sentence, he's using imagery of afterlife. I don't know, I read it all as like one phrase, the imagery of the afterlife, as basically equivalent to dogma, right? Okay. So thinking back again to like Paul on the Damascus Road. Okay, so the Damascus Road is the experience, right? And then, I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, etc., is the symbol. And then, invite Jesus into your heart so you go to heaven when you die is the dogma, right? That with all of the imagery of the afterlife, right? So yeah, so that's the tertiary form again. Mhm.
Floor is open for questions. Another one from the Voegelin room. Go ahead.
Okay, this is almost the same question that Dr. Lorden asked, but how do we distinguish between something like Rousseau's illumination at Vincennes and Muhammad and his revelation? It's really, how do we distinguish between prophets and philosophers? How do we know which ones are legitimate? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that Voegelin is going to give you a handy cheat sheet for figuring out which ones are and aren't. I think, again, like as I said with the Balthasar quote, if you both are attentive to your own experiences of reality and go back through history, and read Rousseau and Muhammad and whoever else, attentive to their experiences and the way that they symbolized them, and attentive to the social orders that develop around certain sets of symbols and the social disorders that follow from symbols becoming dogmatized. That Voegelin would say at a certain point you get a fairly good sense of what people are up to. But I mean, he reads people in certain ways that I and others disagree with, and I read people in ways that that he would disagree with. So that's part of it too. I mean, just because you have an experience of reality doesn't mean that you own it, right? Like there's nothing. None of this is no one possesses order. At most, you have an experience of being drawn toward it and sort of an option of whether or not you're going to commit to following that draw or turn away in one of the various ways that people turn away.
Would Voegelin say that any experiences are illegitimate? Or, I mean, I guess this is back to that question of the hierarchy of experience and how one sorts it out, because now it sounds to me as if I don't know how could there be an illegitimate experience? Well, I guess it would have to be an experience of the divine, right? Or of the divine ground, or being drawn to that. But surely one can be drawn to all sorts of other things. We mentioned pleasures and trivial activities and things of that sort. And how is that, how do we sort out that that's not a divine draw, even though when one is in love, one might think one is being divinely guided by what one loves? Turns out it's Mardi Gras, right? So, I mean, how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, he does. He does have some analysis here of certain things that he calls, he talks about the libido dominandi, which would clearly be sort of a disordered desire towards towards something that one wants, but it is not a being drawn by the honest truth of reality. He talks about, I think he talks about pneumopathology here once or twice. You might have to help me find it.
I think he does. I remember seeing the term at some point.
Yeah, I don't think it doesn't get the full treatment that it gets in other places, but I mean, yeah, sure, he understands that not every experience is necessarily a good one, but I think that he is pretty sure that on some level, the people who he characterizes as being misguided in these kinds of ways, that he thinks that they know what they're doing. On some level, they sense the danger to themselves, to their identities, to their commitments, to their societies, that would come from an honest commitment to seeking the ground, and therefore they come up with ingenious ways of turning away from it. rationalizations or so forth. Yes.
Is this a distinction between, would he adopt a distinction between authentic experience and sort of inauthentic pretense or something of that sort? Or is that not part of his language? It's the language of his contemporaries, this language of authenticity.
Yeah.
But it's not his.
I mean, I guess I'm hung up on the idea that it's the experience that's the problem. Like reality is what it is, and all of us are in it in the same way. So the problem comes with the, each person's reaction to that, right? So if we're going to assume that, like, yeah, I mean, there are these like class of like amazing transcendent experiences that the mystics have and so forth, but there's also just the much more sort of mundane sense of, as I said at the beginning, it's like, I don't know why I'm here, didn't ask to be here, wasn't my idea. Maybe it's a gift, maybe it's an imposition. It sort of depends on like the how I experience my surroundings and so forth. But I can't account for myself. I can't account for the world, nor can I account for like why I face the limitations that I face and why things are the way they are. And even if I can sort of impute some higher power to the fact that things are, things exist that are bigger than me. At the same time, that higher power often seems absent. Frederick Douglass uses the word patient in a rather ironic way, right? So what do you do with that? I mean, that's a sort of, I think that is a sense of reality that is accessible to just about everyone. However you want to characterize it, as gift, as obligation, as presence, as absence, as good, as bad, those are the kind of qualitative flavors that you can put on top of it, but the basic experience is just there. And so I don't think that can be invalid. The invalidity comes from our responses to it, the honesty or dishonesty with which we try to wrestle with it, the extent to which we become aware of wanting reality to be a certain way, and then therefore deciding that because we want it to be that way, that's how it must be, and starting to lie to ourselves. As well as all of the ways that when those sorts of things are done kind of collectively, it creates a context in which it is either easier or harder for most people to come to grips with that basic sense of reality that they're experiencing.
Great. We have a question now from Ben Mabry.
So building off of that, Heidegger famously defines experience from the phenomenological perspective as simply whatever presents itself to you. And so I want to ask if, I down a fifth of cheap rum and I experience a pink elephant. To what extent is that, from the Voegelinian perspective, an experience that can then be analyzed, even though we would say commonsensically, obviously the pink elephant isn't real, obviously it pertains to nothing in reality, but I'm still experiencing it because I downed that fifth of cheap rum.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the very least, you're having an experience of drunkenness, which is probably relatable to some people who have also been drunk. Yeah, sure. I don't think, at least in these essays, Voegelin did not, encounter these kinds of edge cases, and he really is resistant to the modern tendency to just dismiss experience as either purely subjective or as, well, we can explain it away as, it's psychological or neurological illusion or delusion in one way or another. So, I mean, sure, like there are, there are these cases, but I don't think that's, to down a fifth of rum is not to seek the divine ground. You're fundamentally engaged. It's in a different activity at that point. You are doing as the soul recommends at the end, and just eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow you may die anyway. It's going to come soon enough for you.
But is that fundamentally distinct from any of the other ideological deformations of reality? That by downing a fifth of Stalinism or downing a fifth of Maoism, you equally experience delusions. Are we going to go with Heidegger and say experience is experience, or does Voegelin somehow find a way to define it in a way to exclude delusion?
Voegelin has a tendency to he just wants to go to the truest case. And this is, so he doesn't give you a lot of examples to ease the way in, which is, it is for this reason that I tend not to teach Voegelin. I just try to teach like Voegelin, right? So that when I teach Rousseau, for example, I go looking for the experiences that are underlying all of this rather than teaching it at the surface level of symbols or ideas. But because he has that tendency, I'm not sure that the answer to your question is going to be found in what he has to say, at least in these essays.
We have only 5 minutes left and we have 2 questions. So let's take those, and let me urge the questioners to be pointed and succinct. Glenn Hughes is first.
Carol, thank you very much. I thought your comments a few minutes ago about the fact that reality does have the structure that it does, and the issue lies in how one responds to it, reminded me of a comment, I think it's in volume 5 of Order and History, where Voegelin says, well, there is a problem in that one can out-imagine reality. And that reminds me of his analyses of second realities and so forth. And so the question that I throw out at you is, what does it mean to out-imagine reality? And why would one want to out-imagine reality?
Oh, sure, because as the Egyptian man knows, like sometimes it's not very pleasant. And because we have we do all have this capacity to like seek something more, something better, something more permanent. There is a very intense desire to see that, instantiated. And I think this becomes a sort of a problem of symbols too. So when you have like national symbols, for example, liberty and justice for all, or something like that, you can understand that as symbolic of our national aspiration and something that we have to continue to try and fail to meet with each generation. Or you can take that as expressive of the truth about America and then become very defensive whenever anyone points out, as anyone can do at any moment of any day, that like, hey, America is actually not that great at, liberty and justice for all. Can we count the ways? So if you have let yourself imagine that the aspirational symbol is already the reality and you've attached your identity to it. I'm an American, therefore I believe in liberty and justice for all because I live in the nation that expresses it completely. You won't actually be able to respond very well to reality, right? Yeah.
Last question, Andrea Kahn.
Hi, Carol, thank you for being here today and for answering our questions. This is a question that's been on my mind throughout this series, and I'm wondering if you're the best person to ask it. And since Benjamin brought up the phenomenology and experiences of consciousness and the way that Husserl and Heidegger might think about it, I wondered whether you could point me to somewhere where there is a comparison or someone who's done a comparison of Heidegger and Voegelin, because even though Voegelin claims to have been inoculated against Heidegger and sort of very famously says that, as someone who studies Heidegger very closely, I see a lot of connections as far as like thrownness, definitions of the world, not just phenomenological investigations, but also dissatisfaction with the modern project. So I'm just wondering if anyone has made those connections already, that you could point me to those or point us to those. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I know the answer is yes, but I'm not the person to point you toward them. Probably Lee or David would know.
Well, in that case, since David Walsh is listening, I'm going to make that the first question I ask him 2 weeks from now when we resume again. We're off for Ash Wednesday next week. LSU is not in session at our hour, so we'll take that week off and we will resume 2 weeks from now. That's Wednesday, March 9, and David Walsh will be our guest. And we're going to start off by asking him about Voegelin and Heidegger. So David, there's your assignment for a couple weeks. And I hope all of you will join me in thanking Carol Browning Cooper, who is obviously an extraordinarily talented teacher, for what I found to be a very enlightening session. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Jim.
So long.